Hello, my name is Guy Andrews and I'm in my tiny studio just inside of Kent, and today I'm going to be telling you about how I put together and mixed my track called Fjell, which is out on my album called Tolka. I think I get asked a lot as to kind of like how I sort of start tunes, and there never is really kind of like a definitive answer to that. Like sometimes it is basically like a chord progression, sometimes it's drums, sometimes it's even just like a weird sound which I made. In this case, I think as I made this track about 6 months ago, and I've made a lot of music since, so I don't actually know, but I'm going to guess it was probably the percussion. So this is kind of what I'm going to dive into first. As you can see, I have made all my music on Logic. I also use Bitwig as well sometimes, but for this project it was just Logic. But yeah, I'll go into kind of like how I kind of put together my tracks, and also kind of my music is basically much more based around kind of like texture and layer. I'm not really so much sort of like a sort of a big hook and like sort of melody kind of person. I'm much more about kind of like sounds interacting with each other and like weaving in and out of each other. So hopefully kind of like digesting this track from the percussion will kind of explain those kind of methods and kind of let you sort of figure out sort of how I kind of work. It is quite chaotic, so I apologise. It's definitely not logical, as if like the name would suggest, but like of the software. But yeah, it's just the way I work, so I hope you can follow it. So, okay, so I'm going to start off with the kicks, which in this case I have frozen to kind of save CPU. I don't generally tend to bounce stuff too much when I'm producing. Like for all my tracks, like I try and keep stuff as editable as possible, apart from one element of the percussion, which I'll come on to in a minute. So I'll start off with like, the kick drum. Basically, it's this is a predominantly like a sort of a hybrid of post-rock and techno. So the backbone of this track, of course, is like the 4/4 kick drum, which is like synonymous with techno music. So for the kicks, I use basically just Contact by Native Instruments. Literally purely use it to basically just like playback samples. I don't really ever use any of kind of like the internal effects apart from envelopes to help kind of basically kind of sculpt the sound, like the kick sound, so they all kind of like fit together. So they've all got like a similar kind of attack and release and so on and so forth. So I will often sort of structure my kicks into kind of like roughly sort of like frequency bands. So even though they're all labelled exactly the same, it's nice and confusing. They are kind of like covering sort of different areas of like the frequency spectrum. So this one down here, I believe, is one that I just opened up. Is basically like a detuned 808. As I said, it's in Contact. It goes through Sugar Byte's WoW filter. Don't really use it much. It's literally just for like overdrive. So there's not really much to kind of talk about there, but then it goes into one of my favourite plugins, which is Maul by FXpansion. In this case, I am basically just affecting the low end. It's basically multi-band distortion. So if we turn it off, and then if we play back this individual sample, so it's a pretty kind of like, you've got the WoW distortion on there. It sounds pretty flabby, and this is going to make it sound a lot worse. Well, kind of. It's quite sort of quite subtle, because I've got the mix sort of down at 31%. But basically, this kind of like low end, even though alone it sounds like pretty awful, it kind of like equates to sort of like a bigger picture. So when we start to bring in other layers, like this other one, you'll notice actually when I'm sort of working on a single sound, I'll tend to kind of like actually sort of just duplicate the channel strip. So all these three kicks have contacts. They go through the Sugar Byte's kind of WoW filter, and they have the isotope neutron, SPL transient designer as well. So it's really similar processing across all of them, but they're kind of like different sounds. So if we look at like this one which covers like the mid-range, it's kind of like a weaker kick, and then the kick at the top is pretty much like the main sort of body. So that's kind of like a much more sort of like forceful one. All of these are just kind of like one-shot samples which I've sort of collected over the years, and I just kind of combine. And then when you load them all together, you just get like this monstrous kind of like really sort of like flabby, like disgusting kind of kick. Oh, my system overloaded, as always. But yeah, so on its own it kind of like sounds like, yeah, like okay. But when it fits into kind of like the rest of the track, I try to not like focus on making a sound really good on its own. Like it has to be a part of everything else. So like just isolating these three, and like you have like a really sort of like flabby, like kind of like horrible sounding kick drum. But like when it fits into sort of like the bigger picture, it makes a lot more sense sonically, and it's like real sort of like the driving force behind the track. So I'll go into kind of like the sort of like the EQing and processing side of it. So as I said, I use this sort of unfrozen one, which is the detuned 808. Went through more, we'll go through Wave's one knob filter, which is just like a really sort of functional and decent sounding low pass filter. That just goes into kind of a little bit of like sort of well, gain plugin, which is inverting the phase, it looks like. Then it goes into this plugin, which is Neutron by Isotope, and this is I'm not really doing much here, but I really, really like this, and I'll explain more about it sort of further on. This plugin is absolutely great, and I think the EQ sounds really, really good as well. So here I'm just like just boosting the bass on the low end part of the kick. Then using the SPL transient designer to kind of like just sort of accentuate the sort of the snap or the click of the kick. With this particular track, I think I started writing it just before I bought this analog rhythm, which yeah, everyone seems to own at the moment, but there's a really good reason for that because it sounds amazing. But before I got it, I was using another FX extension piece of software called Tremor, which is basically kind of like a little sort of drum synth and sort of like sequencer thing. It sounds really great, it's really quick to use, and it's just really fun to kind of get like sort of quick ideas. So I would kind of create patterns in this, then bounce them out as audio, and sort of work on the principle of like not really being able to edit it afterwards, in terms of like changing like the pattern or kind of like sort of yeah, like the actual kind of drum hits themselves. So I have a number of sort of channels here with like extra percussion, which came out of Tremor. So just play that back. So just it's like another sort of like rhythmic layer, which is like going on sort of like in the background, sort of accents sort of like the kicks, so they kind of like punch through more. Again, it's like just adding like lots and lots of layers going on with sort of different elements and different patterns going on sort of throughout the track. You can see sort of like down here, I think I just used it, I believe maybe just for like a hi-hat, I think. Yeah, sort of like a noise, kind of like white noise kind of thing. Again, just like accentuating sort of like parts of the rhythm. What else have I got here? Yeah, okay, so yeah, another part, another kind of tool that I use a lot is, well, I like working with kind of like real like drum sounds, like real sort of like actual recorded drum samples instead of synthesized elements. So I'm a really big fan of Excellent Audio addictive drums, mainly because they are really usable from like the word go. Like it's just snare sounds that with some basically like basic kind of like processing just sound like just really, really good, and you don't have to sort of mess around too much mixing the drums before you can actually just start actually writing with them, which I find really valuable. So I believe in this case, I'm actually, this channel which I've selected, I'm just using it again for like a, sort of like a hi-hat sound. Just adds a little bit of like realism to it, like that's an actual hi-hat which has been recorded, which I think is like valuable to have that sort of organic element in my kind of compositions. But here I've used it much more so. I tend to literally just go in and sort of like draw in the drum patterns which I'm sort of writing. So this is kind of like a sort of like a drum roll, kind of on snare drum, I believe. This channel I think has like toms as well. I'm not necessarily using it as like this is going to be like a really pure drum sound or whatever. It's more like another kind of like textural element to this. So if we just play this back, so it's quite like a squashed kind of like snare sound. It almost sounds like one consistent kind of texture. Like, yeah, there are sort of like transient peaks there, but it's kind of like quite sort of flattened and almost quite sort of like degraded as well. Again, this is like this is just part of my production process where I'm like working with like another texture ultimately. So this is Addictive Drums. Got this Ludwig Aqualite snare sample. It's really roomy, and I've brought out sort of like the room in it with this is one of my favourite UAD plugins, which is the 1176 SE Legacy. I use this on a lot of kind of like more sort of like realistic or like actually recorded drum samples, because it just has a way of like just like bringing out all of the room in the track and just making these like drums sound absolutely massive, which I'm a really big fan of. That then goes into another UAD plugin, the multi-mode filter by Moog, with a bit of drive and sort of slight sort of like roll off of like high end there. Then the Logic filter, or EQ rather, which I'm a really big fan of, rolling off the low end, sort of boosting the highs more. Then it goes into even more EQing via Neutron. I often tend to use multiple EQs per channel, and I know that's like a really inefficient way of working. But I think just the way I work is that I have quite a short attention span. So I'll be focusing on getting this sound to kind of sound how I want to, and I'll say get up to like the Logic channel EQ there. Then I'll start working on another track, another sort of channel on a different sound. Then I come back to the snares thinking like, oh, this is actually clashing with what I'm working on now. Then I'll just add another EQ. Okay, so I'm a big fan of this particular plugin, Neutron Advanced by Isotope. It's really great because it lets you pretty much EQ. Well, it's a great sound EQ in its own right, but it also lets you basically link multiple instances of the EQ together, so you can pretty much EQ two tracks at once. So here I have it on the my snares and toms track, which I was just explaining, and I have it linked to an EQ, I presume, on my guitar bus. And as I kind of move here, you can see it's actually EQing on the other channel. So this is great because you can basically just EQ things like almost like in parallel. So any kind of like conflicting kind of frequencies you can like address just with like one instance of the EQ, and you can make things fit together. This track was actually particularly hard to mix down because there is so much going on in it, so many different layers, and it's combining kind of like two genres which are often, well, they have like sort of quite a lot of, well, they take up quite a lot of sort of like the frequency range. So you have like guitars which are sort of like quite full sounding alongside sort of like driving like snare drum patterns, with the techno side of it, which is like bass and sort of like synths and like sort of more kind of like high end melody, which is sort of it all clashes with each other. So having the ability to like EQ kind of like two things at once lets you kind of like juggle all of these elements in unison like a lot more efficiently. So I'm a really big fan of Neutron just because of that. Finishing up on the percussion side of things, actually I've got two more things to talk about. This is just like a basic shaker and a pattern that I kind of just drew in. It's just like some samples from like a sample pack, really basic, no processing, really easy. I decided to kind of like make quite a, I was kind of really chuffed with the sound actually. Like it was using delay in a kind of a more of a kind of a creative, using reverb in a more of a creative kind of way. So I wanted to kind of like sort of express like an end of a sort of a section with kind of like a big sort of clap, which was multiple samples. You can see 4 here, which are layered together. And you can hear that there's this huge like reverb tail, and it's also panning around everywhere as well. The way that I did that, again, it's playing out of it's just 4 one-shot clap samples layered on top of each other, playing out of Contact. Goes into Space Designer, which is a reverb plugin with like a huge like 15-second like reverb tail on there. It's like really, really long. Goes into this fantastic Empressor compressor, which basically kind of like squashes it. More kind of like EQing, taking off like the low end, sort of boosting kind of about 2.3K. Just kind of get some more kind of like snappy kind of stuff, and some high end, some more kind of like fizz. And then it goes into this free plugin which I found a little while ago called Pancake 2. It's a great name. Made by Cable Guys. I think they do like a variety of plugins, but this one is really awesome because it basically lets you kind of like sort of map out like a constantly sort of like flowing, almost like LFO kind of thing, but just for panning audio. So you can kind of like sort of make stuff sweep around. Yeah, you can see with this particular sound, like if you have it soloed, when we play it back, you can see it will follow as this it's sort of highlighting on this little kind of like graph thing here. And you can create sort of like really sort of like unique sort of like panning kind of patterns, which otherwise you would normally need to like draw in with like automation. One thing about DAW which I'm switching to recently, Bitwig, is that you've got modulators in this, which kind of do this thing for you, which I'm like a really big fan of. But as Logic doesn't have that, you have to rely on like plugins like this, which are amazing in their own right. So you can still get there, which is good. So like sort of like a triplet feel kind of thing is like often what I use in my like my percussion and just sort of tracks and like sort of the rhythmic elements of my tracks. This kind of like sort of feel, it's kind of got sort of like a little bit of like a swing, I suppose, like or it is like a triplet kind of thing. That was made in Tremor. So I think you can actually see like, or you'll be able to hear like. Because the mindset I was trying to get with using Tremor was that I wasn't able to kind of like go back and revisit a pattern like in an editable form like this after I'd made it. So I wanted to kind of sort of prepare myself for using this by just making sure that like I was kind of committing to ideas. So what I play back in this will probably not even feature in the track. So let's have a listen. Yeah, that definitely didn't make it. So you can kind of see almost like a, what have we got here? Okay, so that's kind of getting close to it. The way that I'd work in this is I would kind of like just draw out sort of kind of like different patterns and then kind of extract kind of elements from the patterns which I kind of make. So the thing I love about Tremor is that it's so quick to kind of like just draw in like kind of like different sort of like drum samples. And then I would just like bounce that and then kind of like just use that as maybe just another sort of like rhythmic kind of like element within the track. And that's how I ended up with this section, where it was literally just a really quick idea in Tremor, which just sort of just transpired into something that fit like rhythmically in the track. So that was pretty much like the thinking behind that that particular element of it. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the bass. elements of my track. And here I have pretty much like 5 or 6 different like synths or sample playback kind of like contacts, again on the 808, sort of loaded up to kind of like basically stack up a load of tracks to create like as big kind of bass as I possibly can. Again, working on the same sort of kind of like principle as I did with the kick drums, where it's kind of like different synths or samples cater for different elements of like the frequency sort of spectrum. So it starts off here with basically just diva and just like a really kind of like basic sound, going through Logic, like arpeggiated just to kind of create the sort of like the staccato kind of thing. Goes into isotope trash, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then I believe the Sanowska stereo tools to invert the phase of it, because when you're working with like so many sort of like instruments operating in the same kind of like frequency range, then you're going to always have phase problems. I don't always solve them. Sometimes having phase problems is actually quite fun, and you kind of get some sort of weird effects. But yeah, so that's kind of like creating sort of like kind of like a, sort of like the almost like a pulse, and like adding to like the rhythm. On top of that, I stack another instance of diva. So diva I use kind of like sort of quite lightly. I would just kind of like get to the sound as like quickly as I possibly can. So there's nothing kind of like really sort of like special like going on here, apart from like sort of really basic use. I just play around with the waveforms and kind of like the filter until I kind of get roughly the sort of the right sound, and then I rely on sort of like external kind of like processing to really kind of like mold it. So this is kind of like more of a sustained sort of bass sound. The external processing again is FX expansion wall. This is it without. This is it with. So it really changes like the whole kind of like dynamic and like the sort of like the sonics of the sound. Moore's really good because you have like lots of different types of distortion, and sort of like emulations of like valves and like different types of kind of like digital distortion as well. I tend to lean more towards like the more digital sounding distortion, because it adds, like in this case, like so this is a really nice kind of like sort of fuzz at on like the top end, which kind of like just really helps kind of like accentuate kind of like this sort of like wall of sound kind of thing, which I'm kind of trying to make. It feels like more of a frequency spectrum, I suppose. So yeah, for these two bits, it's literally just like a sustained note, like just repeats over and over, and then as we kind of like go on further into the track, I kind of like switch the like the bass sounds. So there is one part of the track which is kind of like a sort of like a drop kind of thing, where it kind of gets sort of like quite sort of like tribally sort of, and like just my main aim for this like section was to kind of like just really fill it out just with bass basically. So here the bass switches to another couple synths. There's Strobe 2 and also Madrona Labs Kaivo. I will start with this one first, because this is really interesting, because when I bought this plugin, I just heard it sound like, heard it create these sounds which were just really kind of like organic, and it wasn't really a plugin that I thought I would use for like bass. I think this is just like a preset. If I kind of play it up here, it's kind of like a nice sort of like almost like physically modelled kind of sound. But then when I noticed that when I played it down here, it just like had this absolutely monstrous sort of like really sort of like stereo kind of like bass thing kind of going on, which I really had to include in the track. So that is layered with Strobe 2. They both play exactly the same notes. This is kind of just working with like a low pass like sine sub, and like saw, just kind of like just fill it out a bit. So Strobe 2 is basically, I don't know how best to describe it. I think like for FX Expansion are like with sort of the synths they make is that they're not really modelled on anything, but they've kind of got a sort of like a warm, like analogy kind of sound, which I really like. And this one, in comparison to Strobe 1, I think is just a lot better for low end. So I often go to like Strobe 2 for sort of like filling out low end and like making sort of like really sort of solid like sub bass and kind of like low end sounds. Like the drive here in particular is just really good for kind of just making it, just like warming it up, which I've basically used here. So we have the Kaivo going like that, so it's kind of like a sort of a sustained like low note, and then layered on top of it is Strobe 2. If I kind of remove the Kaivo, so it's just really sort of like sort of flat kind of sound, but it just adds that sort of missing element to the bass. In terms of processing, on a Strobe 2 channel, go through like Logic EQ, just rolling off the high end, boosting the bass, just really kind of like primitive musical EQing. You can see kind of like, I kind of get a bit lazy. I probably should remove these plugins, but you can see kind of like my thought processes and how I'm kind of sculpting it. I think at one point I tried to put like a chorus on this bass, but I didn't. Tried more, didn't use it. I use this a lot on all my tracks actually, for kind of like playing around with like the stereo field and also phase as well. So I've kind of basically pretty much made this mono and inverted the phase, so it sort of fits with the other synth going on. Kaivo, it looks like the processing is pretty minimal on this. Logic compressor. Now I actually send, I do it kind of like the old school way, before Logic released an update where you can send audio directly into like a plugin. On this particular track, I send the kick to like a bus channel, which has no output, and then I assign that bus channel to the sidechain of compressor. So basically, whenever the kick sounds, it will kind of just like squash the bass. It's pretty standard kind of like sort of production trick, but it enables me to kind of like keep a level of clarity with my kick drums, and also have kind of like quite sort of big sort of like bass parts as well. So you can put it all together. So you can still hear like the kick drum kind of coming through, but also there's like a lot of sort of bass frequency sort of being taken up. Moving on further down the track, I obviously decided to try and make a fair amount of noise. Where should I play from? I should play from here maybe. I just have everything playing at once. So if I mute the bass, I solo the bass, it's just like everything at once. Trying to create as much of a wall of sound as possible. I think it's what I try to do with like the bass parts in particular, is that they're quite sort of like, again, like a driving force in terms of like, I don't know, almost like enhancing like the chord progressions ultimately. So I try not to like overly distort them, especially in the low end. The high end can get like as noisy as you want pretty much, but in the low end, to kind of like keep sort of like the tonality and kind of like the sort of like some kind of like recognition in terms of like what's actually going on in the track. I tend to like, distort the low end, but like keep some kind of clarity, so there is like a bit of kind of like, oh yeah, there is actually melody to this, or there is actually like a chord progression going. And I believe as the track goes further on, like everything is getting sort of squashed by the kick, so you get kind of like a real sort of like pumping, like side chain typical kind of thing, which again like helps with the rhythm side of things. The last part of sort of like all of these layers, which I use for bass in my tracks, again is 808. This is slightly overdriven via Sugar Bytes plugin. Also, I really like using the SPL Twin Tube especially like just turning the saturation up like loads basically, because it just really warms up like an 808. So I play this back. I always measure like if it makes my table shake, it's probably going to work on like a sound system. So which it did mildly then. I use 808s in my tracks like quite often, as you saw with the kick. And if I want to kind of go down the more sort of bassy route, kind of more interesting kind of like sort of low end percussion, then I'll use an 808. In this case, it was kind of like on sort of like the drop side of the bass. It was, I didn't want to kind of like sustain that all the way through. I wanted to have kind of like two parts to it. So we have like the sustain note here, and it gets complemented with actually if I solo the drums as well. Then the bass comes in. I wrote that bit of the track mainly because I wanted to like have quite a sparse sounding section which I'd be able to play out live and improvise on the analog rhythm over. So I wanted to kind of keep sort of like the drums sort of like fairly sort of simplistic during that point, but have like bass which sort of like really kind of like hits hard and would like work a sound system, and 808s detuned pretty much always do. So yeah, that pretty much summarises the bass section. So the next section are the strings, and I normally use strings a lot more on my tracks because I find them just really handy to sort of like just basically fill out what would otherwise be sort of empty parts of a song. And I sort of like weirdly like the sound of like software strings for some bizarre reason. I use Vienna Symphonic Library. I believe the sample pack that I have is the just the solo strings. So in this case, I've just got like three like violas going. No processing on them individually. I have a new instance of Vienna Symphonic Library for each one, which I know probably isn't the best way of doing it, but it just kind of like works right for me. But I send them all into the way that I kind of deal with strings. I kind of treat them like a pad, like from a synth. So I send them into like a master bus channel, where I then sort of like compress and apply like reverb and effects to them. So in this case, I'm sending it to the Voxengo Crunchessa, which I absolutely love. This it's like a workhorse. It's really light on the CPU. It's really easy and quick to use. I use it a lot on loads of different stuff. That kind of like evens everything out because the strings, as you can see drawn in here, there's like a lot of kind of like automation in terms of like volume, basically, just to kind of make them sound like a little bit more real. That then goes into this amazing reverb, which is the Lexicon 2T4, the UAD. This adds like a lot of room, sometimes almost like too much room, but I kind of like that. To kind of make it more of a sort of like an artificial sort of synthy, really long like release kind of sound. Then I often put strings through Isotope Trash 2, or like another kind of distortion plugin, because I find when you put software strings through kind of like really like light sort of distortion, they end up sounding like a bit sort of grittier and sort of a little bit more real. So yeah, I'm just very subtly kind of like applying that to them. Then it goes into, again, stereo tools where I'm kind of like reducing the stereo field so they can just kind of like sit a bit kind of tighter in like kind of a more central kind of place in the mix. Strings on this particular track aren't as prominent as they normally are in my other songs. They're just basically just doing like sort of long sustained notes just to add sort of more layer and texture to it. Okay, so that pretty much summarises the strings. Like not much to kind of like say on that. Like they only feature sort of in one small part of this track. But when I'm working on other tracks which have a lot more strings, like the signal chain here would be pretty much exactly the same. I'm always using like the lexicon reverb and the crunchessa to kind of just make them sound sort of like bigger than they actually are, and so they all kind of like gel together. Okay, next section of the track is basically all of like the pads and synths which construct kind of like the melody, and also kind of like define kind of like the sort of like the chord progressions and stuff. I believe this track was the first track which I used Granite by, I think it's New Sonic Arts, which is a cool little kind of like sort of like granular kind of thing, which can basically just create some kind of like really cool, like subtle kind of like textures. I think you can go sort of like quite wild with it as well, but in this case I used it like really subtly. You hear as it fades in. It's almost kind of like a growling. I really like that. Like I ran it through Etch, which is basically kind of like a couple filters and distortion, Maul again, and Logic compressor and sort of EQ, kind of like just to sort of remove like the low end. It's really quiet in the track. You probably wouldn't be able to hear it, but it's just another sort of element adding to sort of like a bigger picture. The bulk of the melody of this track is done in Reactor. I use Razor quite often. I think in this case I think I rarely start from presets, but it seemed that on this track I kind of did that quite often, because I think I knew like what I kind of wanted to write, and I just wanted to kind of get there as quickly as possible. So rather than sort of like slaving over sort of synthesis from scratch, I kind of like use some kind of like presets and then kind of like change them to something kind of completely different. So starting off with this, it's just like this Reverb Error 501 kind of patch, which I've kind of like tweaked around a bit. Sort of makes sort of kind of like a plucky kind of sound. I really like Razor because it's quite easy to create like a lot of like movement in the sounds that you're creating with it. A lot of it again is down to kind of like external processing as well. So on this particular one, it's worth noting that actually that again I sort of like replicated like the channel strip in this case like 3 times, and all of them are running Razor, just with like slightly different kind of like sort of channel kind of processing on there. Okay, so this particular sound goes into Stereo Tools, where I'm kind of like actually opening up sort of like stereo field a bit more. Goes into Space Designer with like a 4-second reverb, sort of like decay. Again into Maul, and then some adjustments of gain, and then back into Etch, where in Etch I don't know if I'm using it on this particular one. Yeah, here we go. So when I hit play, it's basically I'm running it into like a comb filter, which has got some like FM sort of like modulation going on there. So it's kind of like sort of like very, very subtly moving like the filter, and this creates like kind of more movement within the sound itself. So moving on to the next sound, we kind of go down here, and so this sound is like much more kind of like present. Again, it's Reactor building out from the same preset. To be honest, I probably just made this intro sound and then just like duplicated it a few times, depending on kind of like what sort of sound I wanted at different parts of the track. But yeah, there's more kind of processing going on here. So it goes into Stereo Tools again, more reverb, Maul, and then I've got the Transient Designer, so I can kind of like accentuate sort of like the transients a bit, reducing the sustain on there as well. So it's kind of a little bit more sort of like plucky in its sort of kind of like sound. Goes into the compressor, which I've interestingly put in halfway through kind of like the signal chain. I'm not really too sure why I've done that, but the main kind of like focus for this will be for the side chain compression, so we get that sort of like pumping kind of sound. Kind of more sort of like gain control, etch, and again sort of like more EQing. Again, like I could have probably done this all in like on one plugin, well definitely, and I don't really know why I didn't. It's just kind of like coming back to sounds at different times and just thinking that the sound is kind of like already done, and then just adding another layer, and that another layer is basically another EQ. Obviously, I came back to this quite a few times because I've also got Neutron on there as well, with some quite sort of like extreme kind of like EQing on there. Yeah, so it's like basically taking out kind of like resonances and that sort of stuff on there. This particular sound kind of leads on to like basically quite a sort of a techno-inspired like melody. And I believe on this one I use quite a bit of like automation over time, like adjusting kind of like EQ and amounts of reverb, yeah, sustain and decay on Razor, just to kind of like tweak the sound like over time. So when I kind of go to kind of like breakdowns or wanting to build up, I can kind of like, you know, add more or less reverb or kind of like just change sort of like the sound over time. I think at the moment in the track it is yeah, it's got quite a lot more sort of like reverb output, so like wet signal in terms of reverb than it does dry. And I'm kind of sort of like slowly bringing back in the dry signal. So it goes from sort of like a wash of reverb like that, and sort of just gradually brings in like the dry signal to kind of like sort of regain some kind of like clarity basically. Lots of sort of like filter sweeps, just kind of creating sort of like more sort of like movement as we kind of like sort of go on forward throughout the track. So yeah, this is kind of like gradually sort of like evolving over the track. I think the final instance of Razor, again, I believe is built out from the same patch. It's quite interesting because I don't think I consciously did that. Like I'm going to be like starting from this particular preset. It's probably just like I need to adjust the sound and I don't want to affect the like original sound which I made. So this one is like really kind of like sort of like plucky and like it's panning around everywhere. The panning in this case is just done by Logic's like tremolo, so sort of just really straightforward, like just panning left and right. Going into Razor, yeah, it's mainly kind of like sort of yeah, this primes like oscillator, more kind of like comb filters. I really like the reverb that they have in this. It kind of like adds like a lot of space, and also like the compressor has like quite a nice drive on it as well. So let me bring it back. It just adds this sort of like air and this space which is sort of like floating around, and I really like that. I think this is like a really great synth. I definitely use it a lot. So in terms of like the melody side of it from the synth sort of like section, that is actually kind of like pretty much it. We have sort of other sort of synths in the background, kind of doing more kind of chordy sort of stuff. Here is Fuser, so I believe that will be a combination of FX Expansion synths. I think in this case it was Cypher and maybe Strobe, just doing kind of like a really sort of quiet kind of thing. I think it sounds like a bit of like kind of like extra sort of modulation kind of going on there as well. Again, it seems to be that like I'm using kind of quite similar sort of channel strips for all of the processing on this. Like there'll be Maul in there, there'll be Space Design under there in there. In this case, there's like stereo delay. This synth, which feels like the high end, is Absinthe. it's quite a basic use of absynth. It's just, if I unfreeze this, we'll be able to have a look at it. It's just like 3 oscillators, different waveforms, well actually 2 sine waves actually, one sine wave being like an octave below her. Some wave shaping, again going through like a comb filter to kind of get that sort of more metallic kind of sound, and then going into like a multi-tap delay, I believe it is, which creates a sort of quite noisy, high-end kind of synth sound, which in its own right would like really kind of like be quite like overbearing on like the mix. So here it's very evident where I'm using kind of like sidechain compression. Like it would be kind of like sort of pumping like the sound down. It just ends up as like a sort of another layer inside of it. So even though it is kind of like a chord progression going on in there, it's kind of quite a big sound which is sort of like locked down and sort of like reduced into basically something which is just in the background. To finish up on this particular kind of like pad sound which I've created with absynth, in its kind of like original form, it actually sounds kind of quite a lot more kind of digital if we play it back. It's kind of like quite a lot of sort of like clarity in there. To be perfectly honest, like looking back on this, I don't know why I didn't just use this this sound as it is. But I think at the time I was kind of like wanted to play around with a bit more distortion, so I added Trash 2, which just like totally changes the sound. And I absolutely love this plugin. Not only is it doing like insane levels of like sort of wave shaping and like distortion, but it also kind of like models well, I often use it for like sort of like kind of crude like amp modeling, which doesn't really sound like amp modeling really. It doesn't really sound like amps, but it just creates this like kind of like roomy sort of sound. I really love that. It just totally changes the dynamic of the original kind of like source sound from that to that. So again, it kind of like builds it out into kind of like more of a sort of like a all-encompassing kind of like pad for more of like the high end. Neutrons on there as well, rolling off the low end and kind of like performing kind of more kind of like subtractive kind of like EQ there to kind of get rid of like resonances and that sort of stuff. I've stopped playing, but this absynth patch has like a really long like release on it, which I often use because I like having synths kind of like sort of having like long kind of decays into kind of like different sections of my track. It kind of like helps with like sort of transitions and stuff. Okay, so that pretty much summarizes the synth side of it, and maybe apart from like the last this high distortion pad sound, a lot of that is kind of like quite sort of like techno influenced. So I'm really like drawing in my influences of kind of like sort of various kind of like sort of techno artists to kind of like inspire my composition around this bit. But then we're moving on to basically like the guitar parts now, which is where kind of like perhaps apart from like the snare work on this, the post-rock influence kind of comes in. So I have 2 guitars which I use both on this track. I've got a Fender Mustang and a 7-string PRS, which is my newer guitar. The Fender Mustang I've used quite a lot on my tracks over the past like couple years. The PRS is like brand new. It's got like totally different tone to the Mustang, and I kind of end up using it in kind of like quite sort of like a different way. On this particular track, I am running it through kind of like a saved channel strip, which I've used like now for like years, which gives me a kind of like a good sort of like post-rock, like reverbed kind of sound just from like the word go, so I can just start like writing with it. So I believe in terms of the tracks, anything of course marked with Mustang will be the Fender, and then reverb guitar, and of course 7-string will be the PRS. So start off with the reverb guitar here. It's kind of like a really like lo-fi reverbed, messy, probably not very good guitar tone. I'm not really that great at making guitar tones, nor do I kind of proclaim to be. I kind of treat it more as like another element, another kind of synth to fit into kind of like, again, like the bigger picture which I'm sort of working on here. As a result of that, I kind of need to do quite a lot of like processing. So like my guitar channels will often have like multiple kind of compressors, multiple EQs, lots of sort of stuff which will really like musically change the tone to something that I can kind of like roughly use. Like I'm sure if I spent more time like with the amp modelers which I use, which I'll explain in a second, I'll be able to kind of get better sort of source kind of like source material, like source kind of tones. Like the original sound would be like better, but I think I quite like the actual process of spending a couple hours just like really overworking a sound so it turns into something which is like potentially new, even if it does sound rubbish, like soloed. But if it's contextually right into the track, I'm kind of happy. So looking at this this particular one using the PRS, goes into the Crunchessa for a bit of compression, then goes into like a Space Designer for more reverb. I think we're seeing kind of like a pattern here across all the tracks which I'm working on in this project. Then delay, and then the guitar amp modelling I use I often start off with Guitar Rig, because I quite like the sound of like the Citrus amp in it. It kind of adds sort of like quite sort of like a nice kind of like high-end like overdrive, and kind of like a, yeah, sort of like, it's quite sort of like lo-fi. A little bit of reverb in there, a tiny bit of EQ and delay in there. That then goes into another amp modelling bit of software by Positive Grid called Bias Amp. A lot of people like really swear by this, and I do think it's really, really good. I think it probably appeals to people more who are kind of from like a amp like background, like actually using like a physical amplifier, because when it comes to like sort of changing like the tubes and everything like that, I have no idea what any of these are. They're just like different valves and they sound kind of different. So I don't know what I'm doing in this at all. I'm sure if I did, I'm sure if someone taught me, I would be able to like not have to have like, you know, like 20 plugins in this signal flow to create like a usable guitar tone. But it is what it is. I think it's really great, especially when you're using kind of like more like distorted tones. I think Bias Amp is like really like absolutely amazing for that, because it does like have sort of a lot of like low end kind of like warmth to it. And it's cool being able to kind of like sort of move around like a microphone here and like different positioning and everything like that, which is really handy. So that's pretty much, apart from kind of like sort of panning with like sort of this direction mixer and a bit of kind of like adjustments to the gain, like how I kind of like process like my guitars. All of these guitars go into like kind of a guitar bus channel, which then applies kind of like more processing, which I'll come on to in a minute. In terms of the Mustang guitar, it's quite a different sound. It's a lot more kind of like clarity and high end in comparison to that, where it's kind of like more kind of like distortion. This has kind of got a really similar kind of like stack of kind of like plugins. I'm not using Guitar Rig on this, using Bias Amp, adding kind of more reverb via Eventide's Black Hole plugin, which is excellent. I use this a lot actually, especially like creating sort of like ambient kind of like washes with guitars. If you just turn the mix up all the way and increase the size, then you instantly have sort of like guitar-made ambient music. It's brilliant. It's so good. And again, kind of like more EQing. I believe here we've got sort of a bit of kind of like low pass as well, which will get. I normally only tend to use this when I'm kind of like using automation, so I can kind of like sort of like just remove like the high end for like certain parts of the track. So kind of like played together. It's kind of like balancing like clarity and sort of like messy distortion. So I often like with my guitars like work in layers. So if I look at this particular bit here, I've actually got like 3 guitar parts running at once, and I think like from my mindset, it's like I don't ever really intend to perform this music like with a band or anything like that. I think whenever I perform it, it's going to be with my Octatrack and sometimes Ableton and analog rhythm, so I can kind of like afford to kind of maybe be a bit more creative with layering multiple guitar parts without having to worry about needing like 3 guitarists to play back like all of these parts. So yeah, I use like layering a lot with guitars. You can see if I mute them. So there's like quite a lot of stuff going on here. It almost sounds like really messy, and to be fair, it is. But it's all kind of like part of it. I don't know if I'm necessarily trying to like make this like crystal clear in terms of like melodies. As I said, I'm not a sort of like I'm more of a kind of a textural kind of person. I'm not like sort of big hook. I like working with lots of layers, and if it is kind of like just loads of guitar parts going on at once, then so be it. But all of these are basically running into sort of this master bus. There's a bit of automation going on, particularly with this guitar track here, where I kind of wanted to emulate, say like just like putting your sort of like foot on a distortion pedal and sort of like turning it on, so you can hear. Then it gets like really distorted, and I kind of use like varying levels of like distortion through here. So this bit I kind of like wanted to be quite sort of like gritty and like not very clear and distorted, but then when we go into this bit, I wanted a bit more, kind of like a little bit more kind of clarity. So of course, like I sort of dialed down the distortion, and I can. It's quite good with automation because you can sort of like gradually increase sort of distortion, like create sort of like really nice sort of like builds, and that sort of stuff from it. So all of these guitar channels go into one sort of central like guitar bus channel here, where I kind of apply what seems to be quite a lot of like compression and EQing to kind of like basically make it fit with like the rest of the track. I think the hardest thing with including sort of like guitar elements, which especially guitar elements which have got like loads of reverb and gets quite messy with techno, is that sometimes you get like melodies which are in like the same sort of frequency range, so I have to sort of like really like use EQ to kind of like just make them fit basically. So in this case, I'm all the guitars are going into this bus channel. It goes through the Renaissance compressor with waves, which I think is I don't actually use it that often, but I am a fan of it because it is quite warm. So it's kind of like, sort of like quite smooth sounding, which is good. Goes into the UAD LA38. This plugin I use for kind of like basically squashing everything together, like not too much, but like kind of taking out the peaks in order to kind of give me something which is more sort of like solid and something that I can mold more to kind of like the rest of the track. Kind of like it acts as kind of like good glue, I suppose you'd call it. Again, like more reverb goes in there. Stereo tools, not doing anything, which is great, so I could probably remove that. Goes into like the Pultec, which I think is a really fantastic sounding EQ. Just adding sort of like a boost around like 1.5k, and also like looks like 8k as well. That would be kind of just for more presence, so like the guitars kind of are actually heard and they're not completely drowned in the mix. If it's running through API sort of channel strip as well, which I don't use that often. Yeah, it's good, but it's kind of like I find it a bit too obvious when it's on a channel, and it doesn't always apply for kind of what I want to do. But in this case, it was pretty good. Again, going into neutron with some kind of like obviously boosting some kind of like low mid sort of frequencies, and I often find, especially like with like post-rock kind of melodies where they're kind of like higher up in terms of like their range, you get these like horrible resonant frequencies. So that's me here kind of like sort of filtering them out as much as I can. Going through trash again with some like kind of more, well, it's not like 100% wet here. it's just probably adding some kind of like sort of more presence to it. Going into H delay, which is a really cool like delay plugin by Waves. That would just be kind of like a more of like a musical thing. But I think a lot of this I was using kind of like sort of like tremolo picked sort of like sort of playing, so that kind of helps sort of even it out when sometimes like notes would be quieter, sometimes notes would be louder. But if you apply, well, at least I found if you applied a delay to it, it kind of just like evens it out a little bit more. Then more EQing, like taking off any kind of like low end. So when you combine all of these sort of guitar parts together, you do end up with like what is basically a sort of quite a messy like post-rock sound. But what I was using the guitars for here is kind of like forming some kind of melody and sort of like sort of semi-memorable sort of post-rock elements, which would hopefully be sort of familiar with people. Because my thinking behind this track was to be really obvious with the techno elements and also really obvious with the post-rock elements, and not be too abstract in either genre. So people have like familiarity between sort of like quite sort of like Berlin style, like straight techno, with kind of classic sort of Explosions in the Sky-esque kind of like post-rock sort of. And yeah, just it's an okay tone. It's like not like amazing, but again, like I suppose with practice I will become better at making guitar tones. But at the same time, it fits into this like wall of sound, and that was a tone which kind of fit with the sort of techno elements of the track, which is really the hardest thing to do out of all of this. Like compositionally, post-rock and techno have a lot of familiarities. Like they use repetition quite a lot. So when you're writing like post-rock, it's literally like writing a techno melody but on a guitar. So that kind of side of it's not necessarily so challenging, but it really is challenging when you get to like the mixed down phrase. When you have sounds like this, which are taking up quite a lot of like sort of like the frequency spectrum, especially kind of like mid-range and stuff. And balancing that with like one of the synths which I was going through before, which is basically in exactly the same frequency spectrum, it's hard to kind of like make sure that there's clarity in both. And this is why I always kind of aim to kind of sort of intertwine the sounds at different stages of the track. So at one point the guitars will be really present, but then at another point, like the melody for coming from a synth, like the techno influence, will be really present. Having them both at the same time is quite sort of, it's kind of almost like chaotic, but kind of not necessarily in like a good way. So there is a kind of like, this bit is post-rock, this bit is techno, and then there's a bit of sort of like crossover between the two. But like mixing it is basically like a total nightmare. It makes it like really, really hard to actually do. But yeah, that pretty much summarizes the whole sort of like mixing aspect of the track and sort of how I put it together. So if you kind of like sort of zoom out, there's like this project in particular isn't really kind of like as big as some of my other like projects are. I think on this view I've got like 45 tracks. I've got a couple of them are or channels rather. A couple of them are like buses, but normally I end up with like 70 or 80 like these really, really, really big projects. Of just like multiple layers of like texture. In this one, it was more of a concise sort of approach, and I think actually working with guitars on this, them being at sort of like the forefront of a lot of the track, kind of actually helped me sort of reduce the number of synths that I use, and kind of like the number of like sort of other textures, because I spent like just a lot of time just like working on like the guitar melodies and actually focusing on more of like the composition, which is nice. So yeah, that pretty much summarizes this track. Thank you so much for watching my breakdown of Fjell. I hope you learnt it and saw sort of like the chaos which kind of goes on in my musical projects. The track Fjell is out on an album called Talker, which is my latest album out on Houndstooth. It's out now, so if you can go and stream it or download it or buy the vinyl or anything you want to do to support myself and the label, that would be amazing. So thanks for watching.